Welcome to Ownership of U.S. Public Lands in Utah, part of a series of short presentations based on the League of Women Voters of Utah Transfer of Public Lands Movement 2020 educational study, intended to raise awareness about the transfer of public lands movement. The question of who owns the U.S. public lands in Utah and other western states is at the center of a well-organized and well-funded attempt by elected officials and other pro-transfer groups to convince the public, members of Congress, and the U.S. Supreme Court to support the transfer of America's public lands into state ownership, where it could then be sold into private hands. This presentation briefly explains the origin of U.S. public lands, the federal history of land acquisition, dispersion, and retention, the history of Utah statehood and its Enabling Act, along with the current makeup of U.S. public lands in Utah, whose access as part of the U.S. public land system ensures they will be available for all Americans now and in the future, as well as visitors from around the world. What became the United States of America was originally inhabited by indigenous populations with land use practices that were already thousands of years old when Europeans arrived. European powers obtained land title via conquest over Native Americans. In the eastern United States, the 13 original colonies then obtained title to the land from Great Britain following the Revolutionary War. The first public lands were created in 1781 when New York agreed to surrender to the federal government its claim to unsettled territory extending westward to the Mississippi River. The other colonies followed New York's lead, and by 1802, all territory west of the original 13 colonies, from the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River, became public domain lands owned by the federal government. West of the Mississippi River, lands were primarily acquired by the U.S. government from foreign governments, beginning with the Louisiana Purchase from France in 1803 and continuing through treaties with Great Britain and Spain in 1818 and 1819. Texas joined the Union in 1845. Other substantial acquisitions through purchases and treaties occurred between 1846 and 1853 and included the Oregon Country and the Mexican Cession lands of 1848, which comprised the land that makes up all or parts of present-day Arizona, California, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming. 2/3 of the original 1.8 billion acres of public domain acquired by the United States were transferred to individuals, corporations, and states. Most of the public lands were transferred out of the public domain by military bounties, land grants to states, land grants to railroads and wagon roads, and land transfers to individuals. In 1812, Congress established the General Land Office to administer the public domain, with the primary purpose of passing public lands into private ownership. By the middle of the 19th century, through the Homestead Act and other disposal policies, most of the land east of the Mississippi River had been settled and developed. The persistence of federal land ownership across the West was not for lack of effort. Between 1822 and 1884, the federal government made almost 408 million acres of public land available for sale, of which just over 179 million acres were sold. While most of the accessible land east of the Mississippi River had been settled and developed by the mid-19th century, the land of the West was largely unaltered by Western European influence until the first Mormon pioneers entered the Salt Lake Valley in 1847. At that time, the area was claimed by Mexico. The boundaries of the territory of Utah, established after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo following the war with Mexico in 1848, included much of what comprises the state of Nevada, all of the western third of today's state of Colorado, and a small corner of what became the state of Wyoming. In 1850, the Utah Territory was created by an act of Congress. According to information at the Utah Division of Archives and Records Service, all land in Utah became part of the public domain when the United States signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo with Mexico in 1848. This land came into the possession of the United States government with a clear and undisputed title. No state contested title and no private rights had been established previously. Therefore, every original land title in Utah can be traced to a patent or other document transferring that land from the federal government. 18 months after the Statehood Enabling Act was passed, President Cleveland proclaimed the admission of Utah into the Union on an equal footing with the original states, but he did so only after declaring that the terms and conditions prescribed by the Congress for the state to qualify for admission had been duly complied with. Statehood Enabling Acts granted land to states for multiple purposes and required states to disclaim all other claims to land. The statutory disclaimer of title to all other federal lands was included in the Utah Enabling Act and incorporated into the Utah Constitution, and states that the people inhabiting said proposed state do agree and declare that they forever disclaim all right and title to the unappropriated public lands lying within the boundaries thereof, and the said state of Utah shall not be entitled to any further grants of land for any purpose other than as expressly provided in this act. As for why there remains so much federal land in Utah and other western states, in 1877, John Wesley Powell, director of the United States Geologic Survey, observed that except for some land offering timber or pasturage, the far greater part of the land west of the 100th meridian was essentially not farmable because it could not support conventional agriculture requiring at least 20 inches annual rain or irrigation. As of 1905, there were still almost 450 million acres of the United States that remained unreserved and open to settlement. Of these acres, over 418 million acres were in the 11 contiguous western states. The lands that remained were the most difficult from which to earn a living, as settlers selected the best and most valuable lands first. The reason the U.S. still owns much of the West and the land in the state of Utah is because it was too dry to settle. No one wanted it. The federal government tried to give additional public land to the states, but many states refused. In 1929, President Hoover addressed Western governors, declaring that an end should be put to federal landlordism and bureaucracy, and that save for certain mineral rights, the remaining public lands should be ceded to the states in which they lay. States were reluctant to acquire the public domain because the proposed grants excluded subsurface minerals, and states feared that if they accepted the land, they would lose federal reclamation funds, mineral revenue, and highway funds, while incurring increasing administrative costs. Until the 1920s and the birth of large federal irrigation projects, much of the Intermountain West was simply too dry for productive homesteading and agriculture. While disposal laws applied equally across the country, the western landscape was simply less hospitable to settlers. To this day, land ownership reflects these realities. On average, western counties with more arable land have a higher percentage of land in private ownership than counties where arable land is in short supply. Yellowstone is considered to be the world's first national park, set aside not for royalty, but for the common people. The Yellowstone Act of 1872 designated the region as a public pleasuring ground, which would be preserved from injury or spoliation of all timber, mineral deposits, natural curiosities, or wonders within. For a nation bent on settling and exploiting the West, the creation of Yellowstone was surprising. Many congressmen gave it their support simply because they believed the rugged and isolated region was of little economic value. Yet the Yellowstone Act of 1872 set a precedent and popularized the idea of preserving sections of the public domain for use as public parks. 100 years after the founding of the nation, unrestricted, large-scale exploitation of timber resources and overgrazing threatened to destroy the very natural resources relied upon by the United States. Uncontrolled wildfires and denuded and overgrazed mountains destroyed watersheds and led to devastating floods and polluted drinking water, impacting towns and communities. In 1879, Congress created a Public Lands Commission to codify public land laws, classify public lands, and recommend wise disposal and management of these lands. The Commission proposed a law to correct abuses in public lands disposal and management. It advised withdrawal from disposal of public lands chiefly valuable for timber or setting aside portions of these lands as forest reserves. The Commission's report to Congress in 1880 contributed greatly to the Forest Reserve Act finally passed in 1891. That act allowed the president to establish forest reserves from public domain land in order to reduce destructive logging and preserve watersheds. The forest reserves were controlled by the Department of the Interior's General Land Office. The Antiquities Act was enacted in 1906 in response to the destruction of prehistoric ruins and other archaeological sites in the western United States, often by amateur archaeologists and treasure hunters. The act authorizes a president to declare, by public proclamation, historic landmarks, historic and prehistoric structures, and other objects of historic or scientific interest located on federal land as national monuments. It also authorizes the president to reserve parcels of land surrounding these objects, but limits the size of such reservations to the smallest area compatible with the proper care and management of the objects to be protected. Though the Antiquities Act was enacted with a primary goal of preserving archaeological sites, it has also been frequently used to protect naturally occurring objects, such as the geological features within Zion, Bryce, Capitol Reef, and Arches, all of which were established by the Antiquities Act and then later designated national parks by Congress. Responsibility for forest reserves fell under the Department of the Interior until 1905, when President Theodore Roosevelt transferred their care to the Department of Agriculture's new U.S. Forest Service. On August 25, 1916, President Woodrow Wilson signed the act creating the National Park Service, a new federal bureau in the Department of the Interior responsible for protecting the 35 national parks and monuments then managed by the department and those yet to be established. Public agency management of the federal grazing lands began with the passage of the Taylor Grazing Act on June 28, 1934, as dust from the worst storms in the nation's history settled on Washington, D.C. Enacted after decades of rangeland deterioration, conflicts between cattle ranchers and migratory sheep herders, jurisdictional disputes, and states' rights debates, the Act and its amendments ended free access to the range. The new law also effectively closed the rangelands to homesteading in the Dakotas and the western states. The first National Wildlife Refuge was established by executive order in 1903, although it was not until 1966 that the refuges were aggregated into the National Wildlife Refuge System administered by the Fish and Wildlife Service. The National Wildlife Refuge System includes wildlife refuges, national monument areas, waterfowl protection areas, and wildlife coordination units. The Bureau of Land Management was formed in 1946 by combining two existing agencies. One was the Grazing Service, established in 1934 to administer grazing on public rangelands. The other was the General Land Office, which had been created in 1812 to oversee disposal of the federal lands. With historical roots dating back to the earliest days of the nation, the BLM administers the lands that remain from America's original public domain. In 1976, Congress passed the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, FLPMA, an organic act for the BLM that established the agency's multiple-use mandate to serve present and future generations. The act declared that the public lands be retained in federal ownership unless, as a result of the land use planning procedure provided for in the act, it is determined that disposal of a particular parcel will serve the national interest. U.S. public lands in Utah include 6 national forests, 5 national parks, 8 national monuments, 2 national recreation areas, 3 national wildlife refuges, 31 national wilderness areas, 18 national recreation trails, 8 national scenic byways, and 2 national conservation areas. Despite the presence of so many different designations of U.S. public lands in Utah, because the Constitution empowers Congress to turn public lands over to states or private interests if it so wishes, defenders of public lands should not be complacent. Public lands will remain in U.S. ownership only if that policy continues to command the support of the American people. If you would like to learn more about the transfer of public lands movement, go to lwvseu.org and click on Public Lands Project. Thank you for attending this presentation.